He walked into the bank wearing torn clothes, and everyone laughed at him. But what happened next left the entire room frozen in shock. This story will change how you see truth, power, and justice. Watch until the end. You won't believe what unfolds. If this story touches you, don't forget to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The cold afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Chase Bank, casting long thin shadows across the polished marble floor. The air buzzed with the familiar sounds of commerce, the clink of coins, the low murmur of voices, the steady tapping of keyboards behind the counter. Customers waited in line, scrolling through their phones, adjusting their ties, checking their watches. It was just another busy day, and no one expected anything unusual. The heavy glass door creaked open. Heads turned briefly out of habit but quickly dismissed the figure entering. A frail-looking old black man, hunched under a battered brown coat that hung heavily from his narrow shoulders, stepped into the lobby. His gray hair was tucked under a faded cap, and his shoes looked worn down to the soles. Over one shoulder, he carried a weathered canvas bag that sagged with age. He paused just inside the entrance, surveying the room with calm, deliberate eyes. His posture was bent but steady, and every movement he made seemed measured, almost ceremonial. No one recognized him, and no one tried to. Instead, a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. A woman near the ATM clutched her purse a little tighter. A pair of young tellers, Josh and Martin, exchanged amused glances. "Probably thinks this is a shelter," Josh muttered under his breath, smirking. "Or lost," Martin added, chuckling. The old man ignored them. He walked with slow, careful steps toward the center of the lobby. Customers in sharp suits and polished shoes shifted to get out of his way, some doing so with open disdain. When he reached the middle of the lobby, he stopped. The buzz of the bank continued around him, but there was a subtle change in the air, an almost imperceptible tension that began to build. He took a breath, straightened his back as much as he could, and spoke. "This bank," he said, his voice low but clear, "belongs to me." The words floated over the marble floor and hung in the air. For a moment, no one reacted. Then a snicker from the back. Another chuckle. Soon, laughter spread like a wave through the bank. Josh leaned over the counter, laughing openly. "Now that's a new one," he said. "Thinks he owns the place." Martin shook his head, grinning. "Yeah, right." Near the entrance, Stephen Miller, the bank's head of security, narrowed his eyes. He was a tall, broad-shouldered white man, known for his no-nonsense attitude and quick temper. His hand instinctively dropped to rest near his gun holster. Stephen straightened his posture and approached the old man with heavy steps, the authority in his movements unmistakable. "Sir," Stephen said, his tone sharp and patronizing, "whatever it is you're trying to do here, it needs to stop. This is a place of business. You're making people uncomfortable. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before we have a problem." The old man turned his head slowly to face him. His face remained calm, unreadable. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I've come to take back what's mine." Stephen snorted incredulously. "Yeah? And what exactly is that?" The old man's gaze didn't waver. "This bank." Another round of laughter rippled through the lobby. A man near the back laughed so hard he had to lean on the counter for support. Someone muttered, "Call a hospital," under their breath, but the old man didn't flinch. His calm was unshakable, and there was a gravity in his presence that even the laughter couldn't drown out. Stephen's stance shifted. His fingers tapped against the side of his belt, edging closer to the handle of his weapon. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again." Stephen said, louder now, drawing the attention of even more customers. "You need to leave." Still silent, the old man slowly reached down and opened the flap of his worn canvas bag. The room seemed to tense, the mood tilting from mocking amusement to cautious suspicion. Stephen tensed, his hand wrapping firmly around his holster. From the bag, the old man pulled out a bundle wrapped in aged cloth. He set it gently on the marble floor and began to unfold it, his fingers trembling slightly but his motion steady. Layer after layer of cloth revealed a thick, weathered leather ledger. Beside it were stacks of old banknotes, yellowed with age, bearing the Chase logo, but one long since retired, unfamiliar to most in the room. For a moment, the buzzing noise of the bank stopped. A strange hush settled over the lobby as all eyes fixed on the objects the old man had revealed. He lifted the ledger carefully and held it against his chest. "This," he said, "is the original ledger of the Chase Bank. My name is in here. I'm Elijah C.K. Kirby. This bank was stolen from me." No one moved. Stephen blinked, his mouth opening slightly in disbelief. Behind the counter, James Temp, the bank manager, emerged from his office. In his 40s, clean-shaven and always composed, James walked briskly toward the disturbance, a practiced customer service smile already on his lips. "Good afternoon, sir," James said professionally. "Can I help you with something?" The old man didn't hesitate. He placed the ledger on a nearby table and flipped it open, stopping at a page marked with 2 faded signatures. "Here," he said, pointing, "Elijah C.K. Kirby, and here, John Williams, my business partner." James leaned in, expecting to find a mistake, a forgery. But the names were there, clear even through the faded ink, written in an elegant, old-fashioned hand. James straightened up, his smile faltering. "Sir," he said carefully, "this bank has been owned by the Matthews family for 3 generations. I think you must be mistaken." "I am not mistaken," Elijah said firmly. "This ledger is real. I built this bank from nothing. It was taken from me." Stephen stepped closer again, his face flushed with frustration. "This is a scam," Stephen barked. "You're wasting everyone's time." He turned to James. "You want me to call the police?" Before James could respond, Elijah's voice cut through the room. "I have come here not to beg, not to plead, but to show the truth." He stood straighter, his aged frame somehow filling the space around him. The worn ledger lay open before him, the old banknotes spread like fallen leaves of history. James hesitated. Something about the old man's calm, the weight of his words, unsettled him. The laughter had died away completely now. Customers who had moments ago scoffed now watched in uneasy silence. Employees behind the counter whispered among themselves. Stephen's hand still hovered near his gun, but he didn't move. The room, once filled with mockery, now stood frozen, caught between doubt and something more dangerous, the beginning of belief. Elijah C.K. Kirby remained at the center of it all, unmoving, unwavering. He was not finished, not by a long shot, and neither was the truth. The hush that had fallen over the lobby remained thick and heavy, each second stretching longer than the last. Elijah C.K. Kirby stood unmoved, his weathered hands resting on the open ledger before him. Around him, skeptical eyes darted between the aged documents and one another, each person silently grappling with what they were seeing. Stephen Miller, still hovering close, shifted restlessly. His fingers twitched near his holster, his instincts torn between dismissing the old man and addressing the crack of doubt now spreading through the room. Elijah reached into his canvas bag again, moving with the same careful deliberation. From its depths, he pulled out another bundle, this time wrapped in dark blue cloth, stitched at the edges with thread so old it was fraying apart. He unfolded it slowly, revealing brittle sheets of paper, property deeds, business licenses, and a stack of financial documents stamped with the Chase Bank seal from decades ago. Some of the papers were yellowed, others smudged with time, but their authenticity was impossible to miss. James Temp stepped closer to the table, his hands instinctively reaching for the documents. Elijah offered them without hesitation. "These," Elijah said, his voice steady, "are the deeds and agreements from when I founded this bank. Every name, every date, every dollar recorded here speaks of the truth you were never meant to know." James leafed through the papers, his fingers trembling. Dates in the late 1940s, signatures matching those in the ledger, stamps from city offices that no longer even existed. "This can't be," James murmured under his breath, but even he heard the hollowness of his own denial. Stephen scoffed loudly, cutting through the thickening air. "A bunch of dusty papers? You expect us to believe that's proof? Anybody can fake old documents." Elijah didn't even turn to look at him. His gaze stayed locked on James. "In 1948, Elijah began, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "I stood in a room much like this one and announced a dream, a bank that would serve everyone fairly, regardless of who they were." He let the words settle for a moment before continuing. "I was laughed at then, too. They said no black man could own a bank, let alone build one that others would trust. But I did. I worked harder than anyone. I built it from the ground up." Murmurs spread among the employees and customers. Even those who had smirked earlier now listened with uncertain faces. "But success," Elijah said, "brings out true colors." My business partner, John Williams, began meeting with the Matthews family behind my back. They convinced him that the bank's reputation would suffer if people knew a black man had built it. He paused, and for the first time a flicker of pain crossed his face. They told him no one would deposit their money here, that the public would flee, that our dream would die if my face was associated with it. And he listened. The room was silent, but for the occasional creak of shoes shifting against marble. "They forged documents," Elijah said. "They erased my name from the ownership papers. They rewrote the story of this bank so thoroughly that within a few years it was as if I had never existed." James closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the revelation almost visible in his posture. "I fought," Elijah continued. "I hired lawyers. I took them to court. I begged for justice in a system built to ignore me. But no one wanted to listen to a black man in those days. Not about money, not about power, not about truth." Stephen crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "And now," Elijah said, turning slightly to address the entire bank lobby, "after decades of silence, after years of being forgotten, I stand here with the truth. Not to beg, not to ask for pity, but to reclaim what was stolen." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Even those who wanted to dismiss him found it harder to look away. James cleared his throat, struggling to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Kirby," he said, his voice low and uncertain, This is a lot to process. But why now? After all these years, why come back today?" Elijah's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "Because now I have proof no one can deny," he said. "For too long, it was just my word against theirs. Now I hold the documents, the ledger, the deeds, the agreements. Time has a way of bringing hidden things into the light." Stephen took a step forward, his frustration bubbling over. "This is still nothing but a story," he snapped. "You're playing on sympathy. It's not enough to change history." James turned and gave Stephen a sharp look, one that said, "Enough." But Elijah was unshaken. He knelt down beside his canvas bag once more and carefully pulled out one final set of documents. Property records, legal filings, court cases, each showing a clear connection between Elijah C.K. Kirby and the original ownership of Chase Bank. He handed them silently to James, who accepted them with shaken hands. Page after page confirmed the truth Elijah spoke of. James's face paled as the undeniable reality settled onto his shoulders. Elijah straightened again, facing the room. "I do not ask you to rewrite history," he said, his voice steady and solemn. "I ask you to open your eyes and see it for the first time." The customers shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their heads. Others stared openly, their disbelief crumbling piece by piece. Near the back of the lobby, a young teller named Emily Carter, who had been watching the entire scene with wide, uncertain eyes, stepped forward slightly, her brow furrowed with something close to sympathy. James looked down at the documents in his hands, then at the ledger on the table, then up at Elijah. The man before him wasn't a con artist, he wasn't a madman, he was the truth. James's voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "I need time," he said. "I need to review all of this carefully, but if what you're saying is true, we can't ignore it." Elijah nodded once, solemnly. "I never asked for pity," he said. "Only the truth." The tension in the room shifted once more, not to ease, but to a new kind of weight, the beginning of reckoning. What had been dismissed moments ago as madness was slowly becoming undeniable, and what had been buried for more than half a century had finally found its voice. Elijah C.K. Kirby stood firm as the first cracks appeared in the wall of silence around him. He wasn't leaving, and neither was the truth. The heavy silence hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Every eye in the bank was fixed on Elijah C.K. Kirby, who stood tall despite the weight of the decades behind him. The truth was out, undeniable, tangible in the yellowed documents and the open ledger displayed on the table. Stephen Miller, the head of security, seethed near the entrance. His face was a deep red, and his hands twitched with restrained anger. He looked around the room, searching for some kind of support, but found none. The employees behind the counter remained still. The customers stood in awkward silence, and even James Temp, the bank manager, was frozen in place, staring at the truth he could no longer deny. Stephen took a step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. His hand hovered near his gun once more, his instincts pushing him toward action he barely restrained. "This has gone far enough," Stephen barked, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You've said your piece, you've shown your dusty old papers, but this isn't a courtroom. It's a bank, and you need to leave before you make this situation worse." James flinched but didn't intervene yet. He was watching Stephen closely now, his face pale, his mind racing. Elijah remained calm. He didn't move an inch. His gaze, steady and unblinking, locked onto Stephen. "I'm not leaving," Elijah said simply, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the lobby. Stephen's hand tightened around his holster. "I'm warning you," he growled. "Leave now, or I'll make you." The threat was clear. Several customers gasped quietly. A mother near the entrance pulled her child closer. Elijah didn't so much as blink. "I've been threatened before," he said, his voice calm, even soft. "Your anger doesn't scare me. It only tells me that the truth is finally cutting through." Stephen's face twisted with frustration. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his weapon. His breathing grew heavier, and for a moment it seemed inevitable that violence would erupt. James moved. He stepped quickly, placing himself directly between Stephen and Elijah, his hands raised in a pacifying gesture. "Stephen, put it down," James said firmly. "That's an order." Stephen's mouth dropped open in disbelief. His eyes darted from James to Elijah and back again. "You're siding with him?" Stephen spat. "I'm siding with the truth," James said without hesitation. "And what Mr. Kirby has shown us is too real to ignore." Stephen's nostrils flared. "You're going to throw away your career for some old man's fairy tale?" "If my career is built on a lie," James replied, "then it deserves to fall." The bank was silent, the tension nearly unbearable. Even the air seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of history pressing down. Stephen looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to back him up. But the employees behind the counter stared back at him with blank faces. Josh, who had earlier mocked Elijah, now looked down at the floor in shame. Martin avoided Stephen's gaze entirely. The customers remained still. Some of them recorded on their phones, others watched in stunned silence. Stephen's hand hovered over his weapon for another long moment. His chest heaved as he fought an internal battle between fury and futility. Finally, with a jerky motion, he released his grip on the gun and stepped back. "You're all crazy," he muttered under his breath. "You're signing your own death warrants. You know what the Matthews family will do when they hear about this?" James didn't flinch. "Let them come. The truth is already out. They can't bury it again." Stephen sneered but said nothing more. He retreated a few steps, standing near the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes burning with impotent rage. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a quiet shuffle echoed through the lobby. Emily Carter, the young teller who had watched everything unfold, stepped forward. She walked across the marble floor, her heels clicking softly, and approached the table where the ledger and old banknotes lay scattered. She bent down, picked up one of the faded bills, and held it for a moment in her hand. Then she placed it carefully beside the ledger. "I trust him," Emily said, her voice small but firm, "and I'm sorry." The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Josh hesitated, then moved forward as well. He picked up another banknote and added it to the growing pile. "I was wrong," Josh said, not meeting Elijah's eyes. "You deserve better." One by one, the employees followed. Martin, Sarah, even a few customers who'd witnessed the entire event. Each picked up a piece of the past, an old bill, a crumbling document, and laid it beside the ledger as a silent apology, a gesture of solidarity. Elijah stood still, his eyes glistening, but no tears falling. He watched in silence as the very people who had mocked him now acknowledged the truth he had carried alone for decades. Stephen remained by the wall, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with anger. He refused to move. He refused to look at the growing pile of evidence on the table. James stepped closer to Elijah. "I don't know what the next step looks like," James said, his voice quiet but certain. "But I promise you this won't be ignored." Elijah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's all I ever asked," he said softly. The shift in the room was complete. What had begun as ridicule had transformed into a reckoning. The truth had found its voice, and it echoed in every corner of Chase Bank, impossible to silence. Stephen turned on his heel and stalked away, disappearing into the back offices without another word. The others remained, standing together around the table where the past had been laid bare. Elijah C.K. Kirby closed his canvas bag carefully, his movements slow but sure. He didn't leave just yet. He stood for a moment longer, breathing in the heavy, changed air of the lobby. He had fought for too long to rush now. The truth was finally standing with him, and this time it wasn't going anywhere. The lobby remained still long after Stephen's heavy footsteps faded into the back of the bank. No one moved, no one spoke. The pile of old banknotes and documents on the table stood like a monument to a truth long buried but now unmistakably unearthed. Elijah C.K. Kirby stood tall among them, his frail body casting a long shadow across the marble floor. The air around him seemed to hum with quiet authority, the kind that needed no shouting, no threats, just presence. James Temp looked at the employees and customers surrounding him. Their faces reflected a mix of emotions: shock, guilt, uncertainty, but also something else: respect. Something irreversible had shifted. James took a deep breath, gathering himself. "I want everyone here to know," he said, his voice strong despite the quiver beneath it, "that I'm taking these documents directly to the board of directors." Murmurs rippled through the room. "I'm prepared to stand by them," James continued. "If the board tries to deny this or bury it again, I'll go public. I'll speak to the press. I'll take it to court if I have to." There was no applause, just solemn nods, murmured agreements, and the quiet solidarity of those who had seen truth and couldn't unsee it. Emily Carter stepped closer to James's side, her face set with determination. Josh followed her, his earlier shame replaced by resolve. One by one, more employees gathered around James and Elijah, forming a line that hadn't existed before, one that separated those who were ready to confront the truth from those who would rather live in comfortable ignorance. Elijah watched them, his expression unreadable, the weight of the moment sinking into the bones of the building itself. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension with the gravity of lived history. "For over 50 years, Elijah began, I lived with the pain of being erased." His words were quiet but reached every corner of the lobby. "I built this place from nothing. I believed in it. I believed that fairness could overcome fear, that hard work could defeat hate. I was wrong." A heavy pause. "The moment this bank began to thrive, I became invisible. My name was wiped away. My face was hidden. They said it wasn't about me, but about what people wanted to believe." He paused again, and this time his hand gently brushed the worn leather of the old ledger. "I lost more than a business," he said. "I lost my name, my place in this world. And when I fought back, they closed their doors, turned their backs, and raised their voices louder than mine." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, quickly looking down. Josh shifted uncomfortably beside her. "But I never gave up hope," Elijah said, and a tremor ran through his voice. Not weakness, but the weight of endurance. Across the room, a father crouched down to explain in hushed tones to his young daughter what was happening, the importance of the moment. James listened intently, his jaw tightening with determination. Elijah turned slowly toward the large front window of the bank, the afternoon sunlight streaming in, bathing him in a soft, golden glow. He smiled faintly, the lines on his face deepening, not from age alone, but from resilience. Turning back to the gathered employees and customers, Elijah stepped closer to the table and placed his hand firmly on the ledger. "I didn't come here for revenge," he said. "I came to restore what was mine. I came so that no other man, no other person, would have to disappear the way I did. James nodded slowly, deeply moved. "And from this moment forward," James said, "we will make sure your name is never forgotten again." A wave of quiet resolution passed through the room. No cheering, no dramatic declarations, only the solid, unshakable commitment of people who had seen the truth and now bore its weight. In the far corner, Stephen Miller stood silently, his arms crossed tightly, his face locked in a grimace. He said nothing. The fury that had once burned so brightly in him had cooled to something else. Confusion, perhaps even the faintest flicker of shame. He no longer held the power in the room. It had shifted completely, resting now in the hands of truth. Elijah bent slowly and carefully picked up his old canvas bag. He placed the ledger inside first, handling it with reverence, followed by the yellowed documents and worn banknotes. The bag sagged under the weight of history, but he carried it as if it were light. As he turned toward the door, the employees stepped aside without hesitation. Some lowered their heads respectfully, others simply watched, their expressions awed. The heavy glass doors opened, letting in a cool breeze and the bright light of the late afternoon sun. Elijah stepped through them, his shadow stretching long behind him across the marble floor, a proud, unwavering line that could no longer be erased. Inside, James remained standing, staring at the space Elijah had left behind. He turned slowly to Emily and the others, his voice steady. "We have work to do," he said. "A lot of it." Everyone understood. This was not the end. It was the beginning. The battle ahead would be fierce. The Matthews family would not surrender their power quietly. The board of directors would resist. There would be legal fights, public outrage, threats, and attempts to silence them. But Chase Bank would never be the same again. And the name Elijah C.K. Kirby would never be forgotten. The next morning, the executive boardroom at Chase Bank was heavy with tension. The long, polished table gleamed under the sterile lights, surrounded by faces twisted in irritation, disbelief, and barely restrained anger. James Temp entered the room, holding a thick folder pressed tightly to his chest. His steps were slow but steady. Inside the folder were the documents Elijah C.K. Kirby had brought forward the day before: the ledger, the deeds, the old financial agreements, the truth. At the head of the table sat Gregory Matthews, the patriarch of the Matthews family, his sharp gaze piercing into James before a word was spoken. Other board members shifted in their seats, some openly hostile, others wary. They had all heard the rumors spreading through the bank overnight. They had seen the footage captured by customers' phones, already circulating online. They knew something was coming. James placed the folder on the table and opened it deliberately, sliding out the documents one by one. "I'm here to present evidence," he began, his voice calm and measured, "that the founding of Chase Bank has been misrepresented for decades." A murmur rippled through the room. Gregory Matthews' face darkened. "What is the meaning of this?" he snapped. James remained composed. "These are original documents," he said, gesturing to the items now spread across the gleaming table. "The ledger, ownership deeds, court records, all pointing to one fact. Elijah C.K. Kirby was one of the true founders of this bank, and he was erased from its history." Shouts broke out instantly. Board members demanded explanations, dismissed the documents as forgeries, accused James of orchestrating a stunt. Gregory slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. Our family built this bank. Our name is its legacy." James didn't flinch. "You built your legacy on a lie," he said simply. More shouting. One woman at the end of the table stood up, pacing angrily. Another man jabbed a finger at James, his face red with fury. "You'll destroy everything we've built," he shouted. James met their anger with calm resolve. "If what you've built can't survive the truth, then it deserves to fall." Gregory leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "Do you know what you're doing, Temp? Do you know what it means to cross this family?" James nodded. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The board meeting descended into chaos, but James remained standing, refusing to back down. His decision was made. If they refused to act, he would take the evidence public. The choice was now in their hands, but the truth was already free. Within days, news of Elijah C.K. Kirby's story spread like wildfire. Local papers ran front-page articles. National news networks picked it up. Images of Elijah's worn ledger and faded documents flooded social media. Protests erupted outside Chase Bank branches across the city. Crowds gathered with signs that read, "Justice for Kirby" and "Restore the Truth." Customers threatened to close their accounts unless action was taken. Investigations were launched. Law firms began filing motions. Civil rights organizations demanded full recognition of Elijah C.K. Kirby's contributions and reparations for the decades of stolen legacy. At the center of it all stood Elijah, quiet and dignified. He never sought the spotlight, but it found him nonetheless. Reporters camped outside his modest home. Politicians sent representatives begging for meetings. Universities offered to create scholarships in his name. Elijah refused the chaos. He agreed to a single televised interview where he simply said, "I never wanted fame. I wanted the truth. I wanted my name back." Meanwhile, inside the walls of Chase Bank, the world shifted. Gregory Matthews and several members of the board resigned under public pressure. Legal proceedings loomed, and James Temp, backed by the younger employees and a growing tide of public support, began the process of formally acknowledging Elijah's role in the founding of the bank. They commissioned a full historical audit. They renamed the lobby of the original Chase Bank branch the Elijah C.K. Kirby Hall. His portrait, once unimaginable, now hung proudly near the entrance, accompanied by a plaque telling his story, the real story. For Elijah, it was never about revenge. It was about making sure no one else would ever be erased the way he had been. One morning, months after that fateful day in the bank, Elijah stood quietly in front of the newly dedicated plaque. James stood beside him, along with Emily Carter and other employees who had stood up when it mattered. A small crowd gathered: customers, staff, children from a local school. No speeches were made, no fanfare, just quiet respect. Elijah reached out and touched the bronze plaque lightly with his fingertips. The metal was cool under his hand, solid and real. Behind him, the bank hummed with life. A new generation moved through its halls, one that knew the truth. He smiled faintly. The battle had been long. It had taken a lifetime. But standing there, under the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, Elijah C.K. Kirby finally knew. He had won. Not through violence, not through anger, through patience, resilience, and the unyielding power of truth. And now, no matter how the world tried, his name would never be forgotten again. What began as silence turned into a voice that could never be erased. If this story moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you felt.